and I wanted to look at this as the second of the prose treatises that we would look at. I think Milton is justly famed for being a poet rather than a prose stylist. His prose style is, as you've all more or less hinted to me, not the easiest to follow. It's not just Milton that would be the case. Anyone writing in this era would use a style that we would find rather challenging. It's based less on what we call sentences. Like when we are taught to write in school, we are taught to write sentences. They would have understood, following the Ciceronian model, to write in terms of periods, by which they would talk about a structured, they called them cola, so subclauses and so forth, and you could endlessly combine them, often with semicolons and so forth, so that a sentence would go on sometimes for an entire page. You'll see that that carries on through prose writing even into the 19th century, particularly if it's somebody who's not very attentive to the challenges that the reader might have in reading it. So if you read something by Immanuel Kant, for instance, the German philosopher, it's impenetrable rubbish. It's so hard to read. In fact, it's so hard to read that Germans, some of you know I did 3 years of my education in Germany and spoke to some German philosophers in my class, and they confessed to me that when they really struggled with Kant, they went to the English translation. So they read it in a foreign language because the foreign translator had to make sense of Kant for his audience, because translators get blamed for any lack of comprehensibility in the original author. Even if the original author is incomprehensible, still the translator gets blamed. So he's had to do something with the original to make it easier, and so they'll actually read them in English even though they're Germans. So it's just interesting. So there are benefits to translation as well if the original is challenging, and these certainly are challenging, and the educated men of their day are assuming a highly educated and literate audience, and I'm afraid that's not us. We're getting there, we're doing our best, but it's we lack the background that they have. So even when we come to Milton's Paradise Lost, there will be a whole array of names and assumed knowledge in his audience, which is we simply don't have. We don't have that background. I still think the poems work, but less effectively than they could have. Same with this treatise, although I think this one's a lot easier than Areopagitica. It's only 8 pages in the original. Published in 1644, appeared anonymously, and it was presented as a letter in response to a Puritan educational reformer by the name of Samuel Hartley, whom I think you can see at the outset, Mr. Hartley. And it's his most comprehensive statement, that is Milton's, on educational reform. But it is a matter on which he was interested throughout his entire life and did write on from early days. But this is his most comprehensive and mature view of the best way of educating, which is not only a concern to Milton, but of intense concern to his contemporaries. It was a Renaissance humanist concern. It remains a concern in the Puritans, so amongst the reformers. And one of the things that, for us, when we read it, at least just first thoughts here, when we read it, we're struck by how much language one is required to know and the background of information, and it seems like it's so academic that this is impossible, really. This is not a curriculum meant for everyone. It's meant for people like John Milton, and I think there's some truth in that, without a doubt. I think it's a fair point. I'm your professor. I don't have the information that he is presenting here as there for a school pupil. So a fluency in Latin, presumed, Greek, and then in Hebrew. But I will say that John Wesley, this is just by the by, John Wesley in the 18th century when he was graduating from the equivalent of high school, would have been required to write in Greek and in Latin, not only prose. Everyone wrote in Latin, by the way, even into the 19th century. If you were literate, you would have learned Latin in school and been able to write in it, interestingly. Wesley would have not only been required to write in prose for his essays, but in the style of the masters of the classical era. And done the same in poetry. So it's not just use your English words and translate them into Latin, but write using the vocabulary of Horace or Cicero and try and emulate his style, the stylistic features and so forth. And that model of education exists to this day in Germany, I will say. So after I studied classical Greek in Germany, I looked at Homer's Iliad, book 24, which we read in the original then, and you had to learn extra special vocabulary because Homer has his own Greek vocabulary. But then there were stylistic exercises in which you were to write in Greek in the style of Homer. And thereby you would show your fluency in it. To me, that's when I dropped out, by the way, so that's enough. I'm committed to this, and I think it's great, but I think I'm starting this a little bit late in life, and maybe it's not really necessary to do that. But there is something to be said for it. You really get an ear for the original when you write. Like, imagine stylistic exercises, even in English, write in the style of William Shakespeare or John Milton. No reason why students can't do it, other than people don't think it's a good idea to do it. I happen to think it is. But I've never even sought to try and persuade an administrator that I should do that. It's hard enough just to hold the line on what we do at present. But so Milton's tractate here appears to us overly scholastic, but you have to recognize that his age is intensely intellectual. So the fluency with languages that Milton prescribes would be common amongst his peers. Come the Renaissance. So the Renaissance begins in Italy with the recovery of the study of ancient languages and so forth, not just Latin, but also Greek and so forth. As time progresses, come Thomas More, he is correcting some of the, or giving us a better copy of original New Testament texts and so forth. And these lead directly to translations by the reformers of that text into English and German and other languages. So there's an enormous zeal for reading things in their original form, whether it's Greek or Latin or Hebrew. So it's prompted by the desire to read God's word in its original form. And that has remained the case, I would say, in seminaries. Again, it's I'm afraid losing some of that impetus in our day. But there's nothing like reading works in their original. And so there is that. Now, once you've done Greek and Latin and Hebrew in their original, it's not difficult to pick up other languages. When I say not difficult, comparatively not difficult, particularly when you do them at a young age. So Milton prescribes another language, probably by which he means Italian. You can pick up that in months when you're a kid. But I'll come back to that when I come back to it. It's not as challenging as it might appear. But let's talk about the specifics here and what I think is important about it. So the appearance that it's overly intellectual is the one that strikes us. But what would probably will strike us after I lecture, at least I hope, is that this is an intensely practical suggestion that he's making. There's a lot of emphasis on learning things that we would regard as not very surprising for Mr. Milton. So he's going to talk about physical education. He's going to talk about knowledge of plants and agriculture, and by going and visiting people that have expertise in the field. Go to a farmer, go to a fisherman, and learning it directly from the person. How do these things work? And children then spending time with experts in the field, and only then coming to study it in a literary form, so that there's a practical and practical aspect to the learning, which I think people are trying to strike that balance to this day, and not always doing a very good job of it. But not sitting down in a classroom from the age of whatever, JK, all the way up to the end of your university degree and never leaving the classroom, which I think is a terrible model of education. And it doesn't work, furthermore. It works with a few people, but probably even with those people, it would have been better if it were supplemented with other sorts of things. Not just a day field trip to the museum, but a regular acquaintance with things outside the classroom. Practical knowledge and know-how and so forth. So the two things that are going to strike us about this, the one is, both of them are actually Hebraic, or biblical in emphasis. And so he states it right at the outset, and I'll see if I can put it up on the screens, on the screen behind me. The end then of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright. And out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest, by possessing our souls of true virtue, which being united to the heavenly grace of faith makes up the highest perfection. He will derive this directly from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. Shema, O Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And then it will go on to talk about the context for that. I'll put it up on the screen, actually, just so we're all viewed. The Lord is one. You shall love him with all your heart, soul, and your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. Teach, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Okay, well that seems like a wonderful flourish. What does that signify? Well, it signifies, interestingly, first of all, that they're to be passed on and taught. So if you love the Lord your God, then you will teach it to your children. So it's the mandate of education, which is passed to Israel. That is all the people of God. First point. So it's not, education is not peripheral. It's not for some. It's for all. Second point, you're to do it diligently, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, when you rise. In other words, all the time. But it's going to encompass all areas of your life, every waking hour. When you go to bed, when you rise from your bed. It's constantly there, just like prayer is to be constant. Education is to be constant. That means everything that happens in your day is a matter for education and to be transformed by the love of God. That in itself is transformative. So it's not just going to be an academic exercise of learning books. It's learning the love of God, how it transforms all things. And I'm going to come to the Christian application in Ephesians 6 as well, because it's explicitly mentioned there. But so it's there. And then it says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. In other words, what you do in your action. Everything you do in the world of action, symbolized by the hands, things that you do. So the practical life, if you will. Agriculture, you name it. War, peace, any sort of music, anything that's done with the hands, but it's the realm of action. And you shall bind them as frontlets between your eyes. In other words, everything that you see and behold, so your mind and your actions. If you think about the political life versus the contemplative life, it's all comprehended under that, everything, right? Finally, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It will govern what the ancient world will call the